is Sophie. They are 57 Monday, April 9th. 114. 3761. Creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. Chava. 3631. 130. Seth, son of Adam. 3526. 235. Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 3436. 325. Enon, son of Brookdad, Makona Shepherd, son of Mutzah, Al Sephirah, Blessed be Hashem, God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with He commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 18 days, which is 2 weeks and 4 days of the Omer.
22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, using those together, got a huge creation out of nothing. And I love the image of doing. As if God is sort of like hammering away at nothing on something. And it's really, I've always found this image to be very beautiful because it doesn't sort of, God just went, and then everything came into being. It's a sort of working class God in the mind, building things out of nothing with numbers and letters. I always appreciate, the working class God, healing the world out of being. Rosie's a riveter God, not the original kind of God speaking from a throne from on high. So I appreciate that a lot more. What we have, right, in these images of the undergirding structure of every Torah is that word in being profoundly, which language and speech and ontology, metaphysics are connected in a very powerful way. Parmenides, this is echoing perhaps an idea going back to Parmenides, where Parmenides said there's no difference between thought and being. Logos, ontos, ontos and logos, same kind of idea. By the way, often that idea is roaring back in the 20th century and the 21st century. And so, in many ways, pre-modern, but it's become both a pre-modern and a post-modern at the same time. The snake always swallowed the tail. So, Sapiens gives us an idea about how language is being from another, and how being emerges from divine language. Snake swallows tail, right? Also, how one that speaks, us, we can also, because we speak correctly, right? Not that I can, I'm Southern, but if we can speak correctly, right, we can force reality from our will. We can magically use reality. And of course, that's going to underwrite the entire golden legend. And that golden legend, of course, all the way back and at least Talmud, where some rabbis were able or safer get to shape being living creatures, whether they were calf or a human. Now, they're not perfect, right? We never speak as well as God. I don't know what dialect of Hebrew God speaks, but we never speak as well as God does. And the idea, right, that I mentioned that God speaks to many Hebrew, I always love what now they have this, they still separate between all the different pharyngeal and glottal sounds well off both Sephardi and Ashkenazi Hebrew. By the way, the Babylonians can't pronounce it. God doesn't great position, but I feel like rigorous linguistic detail on the part of the rabbis. Great. What we have in the Golden Legend is the ability to speak being into being. Being. Specifically, other people, other animals, of course, remember back that line about living Talmud, it says it really regulates the entire world. Right? So this is a really incredible concept. It's not just that you create people, right? That's already miraculous enough. You can create you can create an entire world. And so this is really tremendous idea of Jewish mythology all the way back to the Talmud, of course, etc. As it sometime before the 10th century. I say sometime before the 10th century. I have my decision which I made last time about Texas. Now, over there in Europe, the backwater that was Europe, again, we also always remember that Europe in the 10th century was a place that no human being in their right mind lived. The Dark Ages movement of a bunch of barbarians. Back in there in the backwater that was Europe in the early Middle Ages, we had some elements put together in what is called Ashkenaz, that is to say, now called Germany. Ashkenaz is sort of a term for Germany. In the German milieu, where we have a couple of different movements going on. And the two movements that matter for us are going to be what is called the Greek cherub circle and what is also called the German pietist or the Chassid Ashkenaz. The unique cherub circle is going to be very important because they're going to develop a very unique theology in which they speak the idea of Hasalut, right? And Hasalut is the idea of, or not, a lot rather the idea of nation, which is to say that God doesn't create being, that there is God, being, God is outside of being. Rather, you would imagine it, like, I always imagine those, like, really fancy weddings that have the big pyramids of champagne, right, where there's, like, one champagne, right, being poured at the top, and it goes down all the different glasses. Well, imagine that there's an infinite amount of champagne, guys that champagne pour down all the glasses, right, and all of the glasses are reality. And so, or whatever, or candle fighting one another, there's lots of things for this. I even heard one of, like, overflowing from oil milk. I don't know if oil's milk, apparently. At any rate, so the idea, right, that what you have is that rather than creation being the creator, we have the idea that creator and creation are part of a continuum, part of a spectrum of reality, where God is the most real thing. At some level, it tatters off into non-being, right? It tatters off into non-being. That's a exception of God's spirit. There's creation over there, God and creation. This idea emerges in the cherub circle. And remember that the cherub was a kind of individual angel, a very special kind of angel, a charm maybe, that is able to be the outer glory of God. There is an inner hidden glory, God is inner transcendent. Outer glory, right? That outer glory, the unique cherub, right? And that the cherub takes the outer glory to the rest of the arm, and that outer glory sort of echoes out into the. That outer glory is part of what creates our. Also, in the Catholic, there's a lot of things about the Catholic point. An earlier theory of this is and its entire movement of the Jewish system in the early parts of the 11th, 12th century in Germany, in Ashkenaz. I would say Germany because Germany conjures up so many of European history. And because Germany wasn't a state at that point, Germany was like a bunch of tiny little foreign states. Like, it's like the year the pandemic, like that's what Germany was. 300 pandemic all went together a bunch of kings. Now, I like to Ashkenaz communicate how amorphous barriers are, right? What was Ashkenaz? You got a general idea of what we're talking something about Germany. We're talking about the area around Regensburg. You may know famous from the area around Regensburg. That is Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard of Bingen, the Chassidei Ashkenaz religion, but anyway, what's really important about this is a lot of natural texts. They preserve a lot of Nicola literature, a lot of amulet literature. They preserve a lot of strange ascetic literature that seems to emerge at the time. And what scholars now think, is that rather than being a mystical movement in Judaism, it's kind of a particularly weird family who happen to be very powerful, right? Who happen to be very, very powerful, have a good bit of money and a good bit of influence. And so the Ashkenaz were famous in ways because of the relative influence they had, and because they were literate. They come from, they were connected to the Kalanimus family, which is the family that. And it seems like what ends up happening is a lot of works are coming in from North Africa and from the Middle Eastern world. They're entering into Italy, and they're being pushed into Ashkenaz via the Kalanimus family. Also, to mention, the Kalanimus family has one of the earliest examples of a possible transgender Jewish person poet. So we have a Kalanimus, one of the members of the Kalanimus family, writing a poem wishing that they were a woman, actually, and probably expressing some, again, like kind of queering transgender identity at the poetic register in the Kalanimus family. That document is not particularly well known. It's a great collection of LGBTQ history in Judaism. And of course, as I'm sure you know, one of the things that make Kabbalah very interesting is how gender bending is. That God is going to be female, male, masculine, feminine, nice. So part of what's going to make Kabbalah so fascinating is the gender bending that's going to go on. We'll talk a bit about that tonight. So again, what degree that comes out of the Kalanimus family, Ashkenaz. We don't know. They're also view aesthetic Jewish ministry, that is, Jews who intentionally harm their bodies in order to get closer to God. Judaism doesn't typically have aesthetic dimensions so much. There's fads, they're very well constrained, you're allowed to go beyond them, but there's also the Ashkenaz who had lots of different penitential and aesthetic practices, like rolling around in the snow to tone. But if you guys in the wintertime here in Michigan want to try out Kasei Ashkenaz practice, you close off the roll around the snow, if you mileage will vary. As I mentioned last time, also the other main text, also critically important for the development of Kabbalah, as we do tonight, is the Sefer Bahir. The Sefer Bahir is the first time in which we have the idea coming from zero, right? The world is sort of the source of nothingness, and from the inner circle over there, we have the idea of Kabbalah, of emanation. Those are in the Sefer Bahir, slammed together, synthesized. And for the first time in the Sefer Bahir, we see the idea that God is in fact emanation. That idea was first in the Sefer Bahir. And so in that way, the Sefer Bahir is the first true Kabbalistic book. So sometimes people ask me, where should I start studying Kabbalah if I want to start reading Kabbalistic literature? Well, no one thinks to be too complicated. Start with the Sefer Bahir, because it's the first. Now, does that mean it's going to be the most introductory? No. Because if you've ever studied any philosopher or any mystic when they're trying to forge a new idea, those texts are often most difficult because they're having to synthesize and work with ideas that are half-formed. Those are half-formed, and they're very growing at it. And a classic example of this is some people, right? If you want to read the first book of metaphysics, go read Parmenides. Go read Aristotle's Metaphysics. Some of those difficult books about metaphysics they've written. Why? Because they're inventing it, right? They're the very language by which you describe things that aren't physical. The most abstract, difficult things you can imagine, language is very low. And the Sefer Bahir is important. Now, again, is it always possible to understand? No, but it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard. But again, I think that the Bahir is a perfectly approachable text in lots of other ways. To say about the Sefer Bahir that are really important as we begin to get into Kabbalah tonight is one, Bahir is graphic. I like that I said typographic without making a single mistake. Typographic texts are just texts that are written as they were being written by someone else, almost always someone more famous than the person writing it. I don't know, Taylor Swift probably not going to write a graphic because Taylor Swift is supposed to write. Taylor Swift's going to sell her book. She's magic. Well, I could write a book. I might attribute it to Swift. Probably a bad idea. I'm sure that she would speak. Well, I couldn't speak. So what I would attribute it to is I could not have been yet, right? The 2,000 years ago, general idea, that's exactly what I contributed to Knox and Moses or whatever. And there's a long history of doing this in Jewish lore. The Sefer Bahir is attributed to a first century sage. That same structure is being picked up by Zohar, which next time, that text is being attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, another century sage. Is also very important for us as well. The last thing I'll say about the Sefer Bahir is that we might call it Gnostic in the text. Gnosticism, as you may remember, was a religious current in the late classical world, the late classical world that 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, and it survived a little longer. In some ways, it survived. And the Gnostic idea is there is the world is fundamentally right, there is a good evil world, the world is bad, the world is good, and the past is out of this prison world, right? We live in a world of totality and the past is out of that world. We see some elements of that in the Sefer Bahir, and also, by the way, in the Sefer Bahir, it's one of the first times we begin to of this imminent God. There, the Chokhmah of wisdom being personified as divine. And that's going to shift and then Kabbalah. proper, because it's also the time where Shekhinah goes from not just being feminine gender grammar-wise, like Talmud, to being feminine gender divine-wise, which is Kabbalah. So again, one of the things you'll see about when we get into Kabbalah is that often what makes Kabbalah very radical is not that it reads text in strange ways. What makes Kabbalah very radical is typically reading text very literally, hyper-literally. So if Shekhinah is a feminine gender grammatical word, they say, no, it's not just grammar, folks. That's being. Because the Torah never makes any mistakes, ever. Nothing's on accident. So if the word is grammatically feminine, that means God must be full stop. And so part of what makes Kabbalah fascinating is not that it bends things around. Of course it does that too. It's at how literal it is. And we'll see that again so far. All right, folks, just briefly, any other questions before we jump into Proto-Kabbalah tonight? Still be in the Proto-Kabbalah world tonight. But again, I think a lot of this will still be Kabbalah as well.
This might be a difficult question, but the authors of these texts, any idea or any speculation on my?
We have a lot of speculation. Sefer Yetzirah, Dahi Weiss has, I think, the best book about Sefer Yetzirah. He claims that it's being written in what he calls narrow rabbinical circles. That is to say, people who are adjacent to the rabbinical world, but also have their knee or have their toe in the philosophical world, Christian Syriac world. We forget that that prior to the Islamic conquest, there was an enormous amount of translation of philosophical texts into Syriac by Christians in places like Syria. And that world was a booming philosophical world. And what ends up happening is that area is conquered by the armies of Islam, and then that view in which that world existed is eclipsed, and texts are rapidly translated into Arabic. And so Dahi Weiss argues, and I think convincingly, that if we look at American literature and we look at some Syriac literature, they are texts look a lot like existing in those views. Does that tell us who? No. Does it maybe tell us when and where? Kind of. So someone with rabbinical knowledge, they're writing in very pure Mishnaic Hebrew, probably in contact with the rabbinical world, but also probably having their toe in philosophical world, maybe in the mystical world, somewhere there. But the problem is that once Islam took over those areas in which the account took over, it gets really jarring. Talking about a couple hundred years and 100 years. That whole thing was quickly closed and liberated. By years, it could have originated in Europe. There are people, scholars, who are much better. Much better. People say they're originated somewhere in Europe. People originated somewhere in Mesopotamia. I've never seen an argument that's slam dunk. So here, just one of these texts where no one originated. Here is much more close to the end of biblical. It reads a lot more literature. So it's so hard to say. One of these things where, I think of poets. When I think about like Arthur Rimbaud, right? I'll just give an example. Someone jumps to mind. Arthur Rimbaud. Arthur Rimbaud was a poet. He existed in poetic circles in France in the 19th century, but created a poetic language. It was basically a birth that gave birth to poetic symbolism as we know it. Modern instrument, modern poetry. And who would have told me that was written somewhere else completely by somebody? Yeah. It's just a genius, weird thing. And so it's so hard to know exactly where these things emerged, how they developed, but everybody here is out. I don't have. I think you have to look at just look at the literature and see the arguments, but I've never seen an argument about someone claiming with urgency. We do know where it took hold. It took hold primarily in Europe. And for many people, that's a good argument. Europe, that's where we see it flourish. Sefer Yetzirah is weird because it seems to flourish in 5 different places simultaneously all through the world. So we see versions of it. We see commentaries being written in Italy at the same time they're being written in Iraq, at the same time they're being written in Egypt. And you're like, how the hell did this text different places pass? And why do they all start writing commentaries in the 10th century? What happened? Right? And the answer is we don't know. Politics is working on this problem. It's profound. Because we know they weren't working together. It's not like the Saudi Gaon and Shabbat and Danilo and Yehuda Barzilai over Spain were all saying, hey, let's write commentaries that we have for us. They didn't know they were doing it. And yet, so, I don't know. It's something going, there's a story there. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know. And also, by the way, Sefer Yetzirah is also proposed in what is sometimes called the Jewish Dark Age. There was a period after the Talmud, but before the rise of the Midrash, where we have basically no document. 300-year period in which nothing could have been written, right? And yet, Sefer Yetzirah was. So it's super profound. Again, and sometimes I tell people, young scholars want to get into the field, I'm like, what to do? I'm like, I have no idea. Basic things we don't think. And it's going to take people who read Persian, it's going to take people who read Arabic, read Hebrew, and people are going to be in these archives in countries like Iraq, in countries like Iran, because it's in those places, I think, where if there is a clue in Syria, if there is a clue to any of this, it's going to be in the state archives of those countries. And yeah, lucky getting someone who can do all that work in the country. Geopolitics soon. Very important. Questions before I jump into tonight. All right, folks. Talk a little bit about what Jewish looked like just before the rise of Kabbalah. Just a couple of social currents that are worth reporting here. I don't have to tell y'all, right, that already by the time the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism is already reflected. There are already several currents of it. Jewish mysticism wasn't one thing by the time Kabbalah appears. You have lots of currents. Kabbalah literature, Jewish magic, Jewish mysticism in a broad way is already very complex by the time Kabbalah. So, in many ways, it has a huge repertoire of things. Secondly, the Jewish world, once Kabbalah appears, had already spent centuries being racked by what is called the Maimonidean controversy. Now, I'm not going to get knee-deep into Maimonidean controversy because it's incredibly complicated, but basically what we have is a debate about the merit of Maimonides. You may remember this, you may have forgotten it, or you may not even know. Maimonides is one of the most divisive figures in the history of Judaism. Now, I know that now everybody likes Maimonides. Maimonides High School, Rambam this, Rambam that, everybody loved him. That was not the case in the Middle. They were people that were very pro-Maimonides, and there were people that were very happy to give Maimonides books to Dominicans to burn them. Jewish communities went to the Dominicans and said, hey, we heard you guys burn heretical literature. Like, yeah, here's some. And they gave Maimonides burned. So, in a big way, Maimonides was an incredibly polarizing figure. Very polarizing. Because on the one hand, many people thought Maimonides rationalized every aspect of Judaism. For them, Maimonides took Judaism, just made everything admittable. And Maimonides didn't bat an eye to it. He would say, oh yeah, demons is metaphor. God has a hand as a metaphor, right? God's made of wind, ruach, metaphor. Maimonides was happy to rationalize aspects of Judaism in a way that does not feel conformed his version of a kind of rationalizing Aristotelian world. Now, there are other Jews at the time who are like, hell no. If the text says they're angels, they're angels. You are not, Maimonides, you are not better than the Torah. You don't get the Torah. The Torah means if they're angels and demons, if the Chazal, if the Talmud, they're angels and demons. And bad, Maimonides. You can be smart and stuff, who knows? And you do not get to undo this. For the Maimonidean controversy, through Europe, especially. And this was not a small matter. And we'll do this maybe later on, but because many people were, I'll make a long story short, if you really think that a lot of this stuff is metaphors, angels and demons and the law and all that kind of stuff metaphors, and if God is really just one mover in the center of all void of space, making everything mechanically move around, do you really care if you pray in a church with God? You might not care. And so when they tell you, right, if you're a wealthy doctor, wealthy lawyer, court physician, wealthy poet, musician, and some guy comes along and says, you got to convert or leave, do you leave your fancy job? Or do you go, it's all about the same? Well, that happened. And many Jews felt that Maimonides led other Jews into conversion. He assimilated them. Right? You think about all the things we talked about in the 20th century about how many people love to hate on assimilation. Well, this was a reaction in the Spanish Jewish world, especially the French Jewish world, where Maimonides really got, people really polarized them. Maimonides. Well, one reaction to rigorous rational philosophy is a kind of romanticism. And we know that, seeing it happen over and over and over in history of philosophy, right? Kant gave way, right? Kant, Descartes, the hyper-rationalism of people like Leibniz gave way to the romanticism of people like Goethe, right? And Schelling, the 19th century German phenomenon, the 19th century German situation, right? You can't imagine the Baroque ideas of Hegel as anything other than a response to the hardcore rationalism and certain kinds of ways of Kant. Romanticism is always a reaction to rationalism in some way, and we see it actually in places about here in the 18th century. Also, what's really important is Jews at the time in Spain are living under the administration, at this time, are living under the administration of Alfonso X. Now, Alfonso X is one of these guys you probably haven't heard of, but actually really important to a lot of things. Because Alfonso X was one of the most tolerant, curious monarchs in European history. He allowed for and encouraged translation between Hebrew and Latin. He encouraged poets, artists, musicians. Probably one of the most benign, enlightened despot. In fact, if you want to think of an enlightened despot par excellence, it was Alfonso X. He was called Alfonso X. And again, also when you get these epithets right, like when you're Philip the Fair or Philip the Bald, these typically are kind of accurate. And Alfonso the Wise was a pretty wise dude. And it's easy that Jews were probably allowed the greatest amount of civil freedom until Napoleon. So if you want to think about it in those terms, right, Alfonso X probably allowed Jews more freedom around than any other European leader until Napoleon. And so Alfonso the Wise set up a relatively liberal, again, within the confines of medieval Christendom, I don't think we'll go into that, but a relatively liberal new idea to be published and to travel. Also, what's important to note about this at the same time is Jews and Christians are living at an unusually close proximity, especially in Spain and Girona, and they're talking at a level that they really hadn't prior, and they really don't ever have. And they're influencing each other. Two things are really worth mentioning. One is the Cathar cult, right? The Cathar heresy, whatever. The Cathars were kind of, it seems like a lay-led, semi-agrarian, dualistic movement of Christendom that lived at the very margin of Catholicism and maybe even outside of it. And they were intensely persecuted by the Catholic Church during what is called the Albigensian. People forget that the first Crusades were not against Muslims; they were Christians against other Christians. The Albigensian Crusades were a crusade against, in many ways, other Christians. Albigensian Catholic Christians. Also, what's important to note about this time period is the time period of the rise of the Marian cult. I say Marian cult. Know that I'm going to use the word cult. I'm using it in a religious studies term. I don't mean the word cult in a negative way. I just mean as an intense religious movement. And that is to say, there was an intense fight in Spain at this time around the image and theology of Mary, and Mary adoration became intense time period in around the early 13th century around Mary. There was a lot of intense veneration of Mary at this time. That's going to matter in a minute, because that's going to be a marketing problem for the Jews. Because Mary is very charismatic. People really like Mary. That's very, they're about that Mary life, right? Mary veneration be enormously popular with rank and file people. Well, it's supply and demand. If the Catholics got the Mary thing, what are the Jews going to get? The answer. Right? In many ways, the feminine aspect of God is the Jewish response to the rise of the Marian veneration. Anything you can do, we can do better. You have the Mother of God, we got the feminine God, right? This is the kind of theological one of the maybe, and the development of Kabbalah. There on the left, you can see Alfonso X. I actually have a coin. I collect medieval coins because I have to have every dorky hobby that one can have. And I actually have a silver dinar of Alfonso X. You can even see minting, that he's really picky about his minting. Minting it especially in a way that previous and after their minting Spanish notorious bad. But Alfonso X really wanted to have beautiful coins minted. You can see that in his mint. But he has an eye to himself. All right. What are the kind of core philosophical problems that are going to intervene in the rise of Kabbalah? Because one of the things I always like to point out to people is that mysticism and rationalism are never really opposed in history until now. It's only in the aftermath of the 18th century that we really oppose mystical and the rational. You don't see that in the Middle Ages. You don't see it in the late classical period. Really modern. Like, and we say philosophical, we really like they're philosophical problems that heavily overlap theology. So it's not quite philosophy, it's not quite theology, it's something in between. Because there was already a developed theology, and there was already developed Jewish philosophy. Not theology. Right? There was a traditional view of God that had been inherited from the Talmud. But either one of them. Cutting edge kind of question between this Neoplatonic question, a bit about philosophy. I think the Platonic question now moving Europe in the Islamic context for the time. And that question is it's a pretty basic question that is answerable. We haven't. There's no one wants a finite. Right? You don't want a God who doesn't know stuff. Like you ask God, hey, what's the derivative of this? You don't want a God who doesn't look out. You want a transcendent God that's all knowing, all powerful, all wise, all good, all the things. Right? You want this God. Everybody wants that transcendent God. And yet, he ain't transcendent. We're immanent. I don't know everything about God. I guarantee you. I don't know everything about that Kabbalah. I don't know everything about most things. 99.999. It's the basic philosophical problem. Yeah. Because this is basic math. Minus 1 until infinity. Infinity minus until infinity. Minus 12 billion, 11 billion, whatever. You can't subtract it up, right? If you think about trying to pull it towards you by subtraction, you never get to. If you try to get to infinity, right, by adding a little bit more, little bit more, you're never going to get there either. Because every time you add to a finite number, you will get to infinity. How do you bridge the gap? Neoplatonism is famous and infamous for trying to solve this problem by adding in what they call hypostasis. Hypostasis is a complicated word for things that are in between. They're things that are in the middle. And so you can see that these go from really complicated, right? Right. So this is the most simple one here on the far left. Is the system of Plotinus, very famous Greek Roman philosopher from the 3rd century. And then by the time we get to Orphic philosophy behind this very small image, you see how very complicated God is. Now, these are just intermediaries between us and God, between the one and the one. Now, if you look at this image, right, or this, I bet you can already see where we're going. If you've ever seen an image of the Sephiroth, Tree of Life, right? See how these look the same? They're starting to look similar. It's because Kabbalists are going to solve the problem pretty in a similar way, right? Again, we have this weird modern idea that mysticism and rationality, mysticism and philosophy can't play together. They always play together. It's the reason. And this is a great example where they clearly. Now, Kabbalah wants to, like I say, have its KPH. They want to maintain that God is in fact infinitely transcendent. They want to maintain that. And they want to maintain that God is immanent. God is the God of the Hebrew Bible that walks around in the cool of the evening with the garden. They want to maintain God's radical transcendence and God's radical immanence. They want to have both. They have to have both. Because God showed up, some God, God is immanent. And also, if God is responsible for being, God must transcend being. Being can't come from being, being must come from something. And so God must also be beyond being. And how Kabbalah is going to solve by introducing 3 concepts that anyone here in Kabbalah already heard of. But you may not know why they're there, right? It's there because we solve these 3 philosophical problems. Now, solve them is a strong word, but the mind of the Kabbalists, they solve them. The first thing is infinite in God. This is the God beyond all being. And self just means the infinite, right? Right? It's just God beyond all being. This is God that is transcendent, that is unknowable, that is beyond everything you could ever imagine, and is beyond all information. But you can't get there. God has to get here. How does God get here? God emanates out that vast, infinite, beyond being, that vast nothingness, no thingness, right? God is no thing. God has to be separated. God has to begin to emanate out of God's self. And how does God emanate out of God's self? Well, God emanates out of God's self in 10 Sephiroth. And those Sephiroth are the emanations cascading out of the Godhead, out of the infinite nothingness of the Godhead, something. And bit by bit, a ladder is breaking down into being. And the very last rung of that ladder is God's presence. Shekhinah, infinite aspect of God, right? God pours out God's presence. And as God pours out God's presence, that in the shelter of that presence, right, is the immanent reality of God in this world. And in some sense, that's that final this world. So the solution to this problem, the gap between the infinite and the finite, the new Platonic problem, Kabbalah is a very, 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 very complicated way of solving that problem using these 3 philosophical devices. Angels, zeros, Shekhinah. Now we're going to greatly complicate that story as we get into this, right? But my argument is that if you boil down the basic problem, that basic problem, the gap between the finite and the basic solution are these 3 things. Now, I say basic, not basic at all. Also, when we get into Kabbalah, as we see, it's much more complicated, right? Much more complicated. Let's talk about some of the early groups of Kabbalists. The earliest one we can talk about, right? We may discuss this lecture that may have to happen. We're actually kind of going fast. We'll make what time we have, and we'll have to pick up next time where we leave off. Pick up next time. The earliest school of Kabbalah that we can recognize as such is what we would call the EU circle. Circle of some, it's somewhere either in southern Spain, although more recent scholarship, or more southern France, also more recent scholarship, Spain. And this group of folks seem to have been a very small group of rabbinical elite folks kind of problem. For them, they also posit the idea that there's some kind of ladder gapping being in the finite. And for them, however, that ladder is actually 13 separate. And what they do is say that there are 10 separate, but that 10 separate contains 3 additional zeros, right? They think that there are 13. Now, you might be asking why 13? Well, because they're trying to solve another problem. And that other problem is that there seem to be certain attributes of the mercy of God in the rabbinical literature make it much more logical. 15 attributes of God rather than 10, to kind of roll the last 3 into the final one. Now, that idea of nesting emanation within emanation, right? That's going to go absolutely bonkers in a couple hundred years. But you have nested separate, nested separate, nested separate, their metaphorical language really makes the unit circle really important. Is that a lot of their symbolic language, like the language of lights, flames, lights of fragrances, right? That when you smell a beautiful rose, right, it doesn't take anything away from the rose. Now, I guess it does, but they know that. Right, but the idea is that when you smell in the rose still stays the same, even though you get the fragrance. So in some ways, you can think about that the rose emitting fragrance image for the emanation of God in the world. This idea survives. If you've ever read the 13 Petal Rose, the idea that the fragrance is given off by the flower that is God. By the way, it's a feminine symbol, right? Flower and the vulva are almost always connected together. Poetry already get this clearing aspect of the nature of the Godhead, where God is feminine, male at the same time, both an active force, right, but also a passive force that human one smelling God is giving off odor. So again, you get this idea where this intervening authority happen. The image of the overflowing fountain, very clear that they're actually looking at medieval fountains, imagining these cascading fountains of the Middle Ages in Spain as kind of like what God is like. Medieval fountains. I've actually gone to Spain and seen some of these medieval fountains in Castile, and they're still there from the time period. You're like, oh wow, that's what they were seeing. They thought of the Sephirah, right? And sometimes they imagine the sun going down, and they see the sun coming through the light of the water, and that images them as very powerful of how the universe, how the cosmos functions. They're also very interested in this Sigrid Ra. They do write some commentaries involving the creation of the golem, and they're very interested philosophically in how creation can and persists. About 30 very brief works of the EU circle, the earliest circle of Kabbalists. They're probably Spain survived, although some of their works are only a page long. The most famous work they produced was a text called The Fountain of Wisdom, and The Fountain of Wisdom goes on to be reprinted well beyond the survival of the Moon Circle. There is a book. I'll give a reference again. I'm going to read basically the major works that have come down to us from the circle. I'll give you a book that you can check out if you want to read some works. Many of them have been trained. Some of them. The other major group here is going to be the Provence Circle. And specifically, the Provence Circle being led by Isaac Klein, who is also referred to as Saki Nahor, which in Aramaic is the one who is full of life. The idea is that while Saki Nahor could see from birth, he could see from his eyes, but he could see with his soul. And his fact that he was blind was not his ability, but actually a disability, because Saki no Hora wasn't deluded like the rest of us. Saki no Hora gets the inner structure of reality, whereas we just see a bunch of illusions. And the idea that Saki no Hora was not blind was light. So I always like to refer to him as Saki no Hora rather than eyes blind, rather focused on his ability than him as a stable person. At any rate, Saki no Hora is arrived in the late part of the 12th century, and he is, as so far as we can tell, the first full-time Kabbalist. He was an adjunct Kabbalist. He was a Kabbalist tenure track. And we can thank him for the amount of the Sephirot, 10. After Saki no Hora picked the number of Sephirot to 10, he uses a verse in the Bible from 1 Chronicles 9:11 to the number of Sephirot to 10 never came to that time, ever. Saki no Hora basically set the stage for Kabbalah in terms of eliminating the amount of Sephirot that there are. And what he argues is that Sephirot actually prior to our world. They're a bridge to our world. So God exists in God's utter transcendence. Sephirot are a kind of intermundia, world. And our world is what is connected by the ladder of the Sephirot to the world. So, and this will be a debate, by the way, a lot in Kabbalah, is to what degree does the Sephirot exist in our world or beyond our world, or are they a part of our world? Do they transcend our world? In what world do they exist? They exist before or after creation, right? When God did before, that inaugurates the development of the Sephirot, or do they prior to that? I think more actually argues in a really dramatic, inconvenient, there's another word for it. What he does is to prove that the Sephirot exists prior to our world. Saki no Hora actually goes to the Bible, the book of Genesis, and he describes how the very first chapters of Genesis, the creation story, do not describe the creation of our world. For Saki no Hora, the Genesis creation story, there was light, and there was a firmament, and all this stuff. For him, that's not our world. That's the world for our world. The Genesis creation story, the first Genesis creation story, describes the world. The second one too describes the generation of the post-divine world, the world after God is transcendent, but before our world. Now, we're very lucky because our world mirrors that world, and therefore the Genesis story is a double duty. Read on one level is the story of how our world came into existence. But read on a deeper level, on a more transcendent level, it's the story of how the eternal world, the world of Sephirot, came into existence. And so if you know how to read it correctly, or in a Saki no Hora, very esoteric way, you can read into the Genesis story the preternatural coming into being of the world. And his commentary is, to my mind, the commentary to do that. Now, Sacred Par, which will be beginning next week, spends 100 pages on that. So again, Saki no Hora set the stage for what's going to become a huge unfolding of the world of Zohar and the world of the Kabbalah proper. Now, as you might imagine, Saki no Hora also prohibited teaching these ideas to the public, even prohibited writing them down. He had a famous quote that students over in Castile, where he said, and I live in Provence, he said, look, if you book in a cupboard, if you lock a book in a cupboard, it's going to get out, right? And so he says, write this stuff down, right? And he says, candle is in the cupboard. Why? It's the light shining in. If you try to conceal a candle in a cupboard, well, if you try to conceal the stuff, books, it's not going to work. Why? Find the books. We're going to publish the books. We're going to copy them. And so he's the first person to actively bid the writing disseminate this material. And what ended up happening is they further disseminated and they further write it down and they began to disseminate it. Here, this Verona synagogue, which is there. Verona, I've been there. It's very weird to walk around Jewish Verona knowing that Kabbalah was basically for like a and trauma usually very Rabbi Azrael, one of the of Saginaw students, systematizes the Sephiroth for the first time. And not only does he systematize Sephiroth, very doctrines about the Sephiroth into what is basically a Kabbalist catechism. When I say catechism, I mean catechism. Question, answer, catechism. And Catholics do love it each other. Catholics are the Catholics, right? Right? Many Jews look scholastic question and answer and they copy. And Rabbi Rothschild to systematize Kabbalah, anyway, first check out how ancient brought something like a couple of catechisms, also whatever Maimonides, probably know as the Ramban, right? Maimonides is one of the most famous Bible commentators in the time of the ages, and he's famous for pointing out mystical parts of the Bible in his commentary. Now, his but he always says, right, he always he's very curious, right, when there's a couple of things happening. Here's the thing. There's these signposts in his commentary, all right? There's a couple of things. And anyway, Maimonides' commentary on the Bible goes through things that became Kabbalah more mainstream. And we're going to see it be an issue, right? Kabbalah has always had a problem. It's always the case that's been very alluring. Rabbis have always been pretty skeptical of it for many years. And Maimonides, one of the main a lot of Kabbalistic ideas, like Bible comments. But some you don't have to say it. It's legitimate thing. And by legitimating it, by the way, we've already seen that happen with Sefer Yetzirah, right? Sefer Yetzirah basically became part of the Jewish canon. Very famous Jews like Barzillai, Shabbat Polo, Rabbi Rothschild, all wrote commentaries. Well, if they wrote commentaries on it, it must be true. Well, ditto, if Maimonides has written, right, if you understand this, right, I'll read Derech, right, understand this, right, I'll read Derech. Way of truth, it must be also, Jacob and Shusha were basically a moralizing, right? Moralizing treaty, moralizing treaties over get into, how was God this right to maintain God, and part of what Shusha wants to do is maintain a very traditional mystical throne of God, as opposed to commodities, metaphorical, symbolic, non-literal, national. Last one, folks, for to wrap up. We now have to Castile, right, into central northern Spain. In the drama of the Kabbalah is playing itself out in France, Spain, over here now, too. The Castile circle really focused in on two brothers, Coen brothers. You're now thinking Coen brothers, like movies. No. Coen brothers, Castile, and they both claim to have found hidden lost books. Now, these lost books they claimed to have found, but didn't use that claim. There was a lot of. I think that in mind. Scholars think they had some from maybe late antiquity, maybe a little later, but there's reason to believe that some of the things they were looking at weren't completely made up out of their head. And what we get in Rabbi Jacob is very interesting interpretation, very esoteric interpretation of letters. That idea of esoteric interpretation of letters is large. Here, we get another version of Rabbi Jacob and Rabbi Isaac. We can perhaps one of the most shocking books, I think, most top 3 shocking books ever written in Judaism. It's a book called The Tradition of Legend Size. And what Rabbi Isaac argues is that flowing down the left side of the information structure of the divine is evil. That evil is a quintessential aspect of the development of God, that the Sephirot have an inherently evil concept that could not have been, right? Now, this is very important, because traditionally in Judaism and in Christianity and in Islam, evil has typically been imagined deprivation. It's like cold deprivation of heat, or darkness deprivation of light. Many theologians argue that darkness doesn't exist on its own. The Cohen brothers, specifically in the tractate on the trees of the emanation left hand side, argues no. Evil, part and parcel of the structure of reality. It could not have been otherwise. And further, God tried to constrain it. Word. God tried to constrain it 3 different times. Every time. Back, horrifying reality. And by the 3rd time, what ends up happening is there's an entire alt separate system on the backside of the separate system. Imagine the divine system, right? With like all the little dots for it. Well, imagine the first version. That version is evil, right? Now the first 3 are destroyed. God destroys them. The rest remain. And the last 7 are demonic forces that stick to our reality. And those demonic forces are part and parcel of the necessary structure of reality. So this is where evil is actually primordial. Evil existed before creation itself, and will be here until creation is destroyed. This idea, right? The idea that evil is primal, really influential early Kabbalah, and the idea that evil is fundamental to reality is going to go directly. So what's going to end up happening is evil is going to be here basically. Sky comes, transform. So insofar as a reality, that reality penetrated inherently logically. Now, the idea, all right, that we can resist that evil by doing this idea coming from when you do the law of God, you follow the Torah, you're not just following the rule of God, what you're actually doing is physical warfare. When you when you give money for, you're not just resisting. You're engaged in a battle where this attack against the demonic forces by pushing back the demonic forces of evil, create the kind of gap that the idea is that the Talmud's also about this. Messiah only comes when a generation serves it, the righteous deeds, or when the whole is so on the Messiah. And so the idea here is you must do the work of creating a gap through righteousness, forces of people, come through by Allah. So the treason of the explanation on the left hand side, we're going to see that we'll get into the five important elements of the Kabbalistic, which is not anything like Maimonides, nothing like St. Augustine, nothing like the proponents of Al-Ashari, Islamic tradition. Rigorous idea, real, part of reality must be acted. Yeah, but also there you go, right? Art, right? Where you have, if you're art, right? You can do that around the time of the Middle Ages, hanging on the cross is very serene. But by the High Middle Ages, he's bloated, green, dangling almost in a Y shape. Body is frail, broken. Comes like huge conception. In the 13th century in Spain, see those ideas into in this folks, to wrap up giving a question, I went a little bit longer than normal. It can be motion, right? In custody, in the middle of the 13th, and it is around mostly on a book called the Zohar. And if you think about Zohar, anything about Kabbalah, this is the central text of Jewish mysticism for Zohar. And I will say, in many ways, it's the last text gained universal recognition by all of the world's Jews as and once more before we insert another. The Sefer Zohar, look at the Zohar, last text gaining universal recognition from Jews, Yemen, Spain, Northern Europe, North Africa, Jews in North America, Jews, all of the world accepted, came to accept the authority of the Sefer Zohar, and it is the last poetry. The only really rejected, I think, reform. They reject, right? So they decanonized. Prior to that, no Jewish group, no Jewish community that didn't think at some levels are basis. I argue and reclaim it. Right? You can reclaim it. Most of the things out there are you can make it. You can reclaim it. Because of what it does. You should reclaim it what it does in language. Most modern anyway. We should do it for what it does in all hours. We should reclaim it because it's ours. And it should not be the unique purview of the creating world claim it there. Part of ours. And so we'll get to it starting. There's some things here on early Kabbalah. It's the Dawn book. Early Kabbalah, I would say, is pound for pound the best book of Kabbalah. Early Kabbalah, early Kabbalah, pretty aptly titled. He covers a lot of the stuff. The treatise of the emanation, the treatise of the emanation left inside is also in the early Kabbalah. Also, there's a great book he has on the cherub circle. The guys who invented Hatzlah Nation. He has a whole book on them. That's the ILL now. If you want to read about the Unity Circle, Kabbalist, Herman, great book on them. The entire text of the Sefer Question is reproduced by Kaplan, although I will say that my caveat one of the practicing Lurianic Kabbalism, we'll get to Lurianic Kabbalah in a few weeks, and he kind of reads back into the scripture like drawings here later, distort them a little bit, but still a good text and still a good translation, nonetheless, and reproduced. All right, next week, folks, we get to the big one. It's been an entire session on this. I could do an entire class. I could do an entire class. I could do the rest of my life. an entire class on it. I'm my very best to teach oriented concept into some of the functions. This is intimidating text. And I'll admit, it's the most intimidating text I know of. Like Hegel, Price, compared to Hegel, right? Like just, your spirit, it's like training. So, super welcome back. Thank you for joining as I explore the garden of Jewish and Kabbalah. Again, I'd like to support my work by providing free scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and cult, magic, philosophy. Work on Patreon, perhaps the one-time. You can find those below.